Then Professor Welch says, through the years, my associations with Bernard Jackson, I thought this was interesting how he gives an appreciation of his association with such a fabulous Jewish scholar as Bernard Jackson. And his scholarship have been particularly rewarding for me, he says. While in Oxford to attend his speaker's lecture series in 1985, I read his 1972 treatise on the theft in early Jewish law, which sharply distinguishes between the concepts of theft and robbery in the ancient world. It struck me that this analysis could be applied directly to the Gadianton robbers in the Book of Mormon and to the legal concepts of theft and robbery in Nephite society. And it does. In fact, the Book of Mormon never confuses the two through its 500 pages of history. It treats thievery differently than robbery, and it treats it according to ancient Jewish law. It's an utterly fascinating topic of Professor Welch's. He says Jackson's kindness. Oh, he says he invited Professor Jackson to lecture at Brigham Young University. He said, and in turn, Professor Jackson invited me in 1993 to make a presentation on the trial of Jesus to the British Association of Jewish Studies in Liverpool. He says Jackson's kindness was such that he agreed to spend a week one summer during his year at the University of Kent at Canterbury reading and discussing various legal texts in the Book of Mormon with John Welch. I'm very grateful to Professor Jackson for this time we spent together exploring Sherem's accusations against Jacob chapter 7, verses 1 through 21, the trial of Abinadi, Moses 12, 19 through chapter 17, verse 1, the blasphemy of Korihor, Alma 30, and many of the other legal proceedings in the Book of Mormon discussed in his text Here Now. As we read, he pulled books down that I had never seen before off the shelves in his library for comparison. His comments about these cases were riveting as we walked together from campus to his Canterbury home and as we sat in the shade of a large willow tree overlooking the Canterbury Cathedral Tower and the English landscape below. So much for biblical scholars not taking the LDS scholars seriously, or being their friends, or researching with them, or peer-reviewing their information on the Book of Mormon. Bernard Jackson spent a week studying the Book of Mormon with Professor Welch. That's impressive. That refutes the critics' claims, hands down, that nobody takes the Book of Mormon seriously and nobody takes LDS scholarship on the Book of Mormon seriously. That's a false claim. Professor Welch shows otherwise. It's very impressive. Then he says in the 1980s and 1990s, he presented various papers on different legalistic approaches of Lehi's final blessings to his sons and posterity, the law of war in the Book of Mormon, the explaining of the law of martial law, the rule of martial law, and how it works, as applied under the law of Moses, and so on and so forth. The law of the temple, he explains the law of the apostate cities, and they appeared in a volume of research studies that was published. Those studies shed light on additional links between the Book of Mormon and legal materials from the ancient world, such as the Hebrew legal terminology, kingship and law-giving, inheritance law, legally required holy days, the laws of apostasy and false prophecy, the rules of evidence, various crimes and punishments, military laws, collective responsibility, legally established weights and measures, and the speechlessness of an opposing opponent or litigant. That's how detailed and informative the Book of Mormon is on various aspects of ancient law. Professor Welch has uncovered all of this in his 500-page magnum opus. It's breathtaking. It's very impressive. He goes on to say, that that at the same time correspondence with various scholars invariably enriched my studies, I became a member of the Jewish Law Association. 1990 presented a paper entitled Chiasmus in Biblical Law. At the biannual meeting of the association in Boston is where he presented this paper. It discussed several texts, including the marvelous chiasmus in the case of the blasphemer of Leviticus 24:13 through 23. He says what the chiasmus in Leviticus shows is literally, it depicts the concept of reciprocity that is so fundamental to the ancient Jewish concept of justice. The paper also pointed out the very creative use of chiasmus by Alma in Alma 41, which similarly represents the aspect of reciprocity or restoration that undergirded the Nephite concept of justice. Now this is interesting, because several of the Jewish scholars at the Boston Conference were fascinated. Others were puzzled, and he said there were a few that were bemused that a Gentile could show them something that they had overlooked in their own Hebrew Bible. I thought that was kind of amusing. Very interesting. But he was well received where he presents chiasmus in the biblical text as well as the Book of Mormon text. They didn't just guffaw like the silly anti-Mormon critics do. In 1995, I focused attention on ancient legal deeds. This led further to his discovery of the double seal type of document in antiquity, and he showed how the case can match the Book of Mormon as being a double sealed book also. He says in 1997, another conference was sponsored by the Liberty Fund to study the concept of justice in the Book of Mormon. As a result, a dozen first-rate scholars, many of whom were reading the Book of Mormon in depth for the first time, found significant jurisprudential ideas bubbling off the pages again and again, as one of the scholars put it. That's a fascinating concept. Once you know what to look for in the Book of Mormon from an ancient legal perspective, it's there and it keeps bubbling up. That's interesting. They don't find it phony, crabbed, invented, and a fairy tale fantasy at all. They find it to be a very strong text with ancient legal concepts. February 2001, the momentum continued to build as Farm sponsored a day-long conference on Hebrew law in the Book of Mormon. That was eventually published, and they republished Professor Zev Falk's Hebrew Law in Biblical Times. And he was one of his friends. He died before that publication could come about, however. He didn't live to see it republished. In 2004, they all produced, David Rolfe Seeley and Joanne H. Seeley collaborated in producing a book called Glimpses of Lehi's Jerusalem, where they discussed the world of Jerusalem, 600 BC, and the legal ramifications and ideas displayed in how the king was functioning in relation to foreign powers, how the prophets were functioning, so on and so forth. It's a 600-page in-depth look at Jerusalem, 600 BC. Many legal perspectives were discussed in that book also. Opportunities such as these have opened interesting doors, he says, and have led to rewarding experiences in the studies of ancient Israelite laws. Beginning in 1995, my students and I provided the abstracts of biblical law articles for the survey of current literature in the Jewish Law Annual.